We want to overcome that because it gives us mistrust in each other, that everybody just wants to maximize their financial profit. We are not saying that financial profit is a bad thing. We are not saying it's a bad thing. We're just saying it needs to be in a different setting, in a safe and just space for humanity. And this mistrust thing needs to be overcome. We seek for more optimization. Also, I think the pursuit for happiness is something that people from the US American side would buy into. And there's just much more in life what people look for, and we want to accept that, and therefore become a bit broader in the assumption what the people who we deal with want. And the second one, it's also a tricky one, but also one of the, a really nice North Star. If you don't decide profit is your goal, but having a great impact is your goal, then profit can be part of that. But you would also consider that you want to do that within a healthy planet. Right now we consume 1.74 Earths, but we only have one. And you want to do that somehow for the good of all. And if you take this into account seriously, and not just in an extra sustainability stuff, but you take it seriously and say, we accept that. And within that, we want to make profits. But it's impact first and then the profit. That's the second paradigm shift, which we want to somehow make people really interested in and go on that way with us.
Philipp, whether it's at the recent meetings of the Conference of the Parties, the COP, or at a place like the WEF, the World Economic Forum in Davos, global corporate players fall over each other to demonstrate their green credentials. And there are, of course, coalitions, initiatives, a plethora of calls for action. But for smaller companies, it's often a lot more complicated. And Katharina referred to that, saying the incentives often aren't really right. And it can look more profitable not to take climate action. Transforming a business model is costly, it's complex. What do you tell small firms who point that out and say that sustainability and profit simply aren't compatible?
Yeah, I think it definitely is a tough reality that it's not easy to align sustainability with profitability. And in fact, I think for any business, large or small, taking a science-aligned, ambitious stance on sustainability doesn't immediately translate into quick-term profits. In contrary, often it takes a long-term transformative view. And of course, companies with lots of resources can do that easier than those that really look for survival in the next quarter. What we always say to companies that come to us and want to embark on a transformation journey is really to look at three key questions independently, which is first, what's your core business contribution towards a future fit economy? Then second, what is your value chain performance? And the difference here is your core business contribution is what you do. Is it renewable energy that other people need to power their operations? Or is it harmful substances, for example? Then the value chain performance is really how you create your product or service. And the first question, what's your core business contribution, really determines whether you have a very fundamental transformation agenda ahead of you. If you deliver green electricity, healthy food, or provide education services, that's already aligned with the future fit economy. Then it's really just about improving the value chain performance. But if you produce internal combustion engines, then that is no longer aligning with a future fit economy. And so you really need to transform your core business, and that's much more complex. And there I would always say, if you have that transformational challenge ahead of you, then you're left with a tough choice to either fundamentally transform, or at the end of the day, you would always have to pay more to be less bad. But you can never be a building block of a future fit economy. That's why it's so important to not just fix a couple of things in your value chain, but to consider the fundamental contribution of your core business.
And Matthias, for a publicly traded company like Bayer, a long-term view, which we've just heard emphasized, that prioritizes sustainability might not always be the quickest path to a bottom line that pleases the markets. So how does Bayer juggle that trade-off?
Well, first of all, we also fight for survival quarter by quarter. I mean, that's pretty clear. Bayer has quite a few challenges. We placed a big bet on acquiring Monsanto a couple of years ago, and we are still dealing with the challenges that come with integrating a $60 billion acquisition. And sometimes the market is a bit impatient looking at what we are doing. However, we also have seen a shift in our investors' mindset. So our largest investors want to support the journey you talked about in your introduction to carbon neutrality. There has been a lot of activity on the environment, social, and governance side on the investors approach to business, and of course we are building on that. In the long run, however, we as a company have to demonstrate that the innovations in the sustainability space are actually also good business. If you can't demonstrate that, then of course even the most ESG-minded investors will struggle with supporting you. And in the case of Bayer, we focus on three problems that I believe create lots of opportunity if you find creative, scalable solutions. It's one, the 54 gigatons of carbon emissions that we struggle with. So if you want to peak emissions at one point, we have to reduce the overall emissions of the global economy. The second challenge is that roughly 4 billion people don't have basic access to health. And then the third challenge is that a rising number, close to 400 million, don't have access to food. So in other words, they are acutely food insecure. And those four challenges, or those three challenges, are challenges that we can contribute to as a company, and that we can anchor our sustainability transition in. And that's kind of the journey we are on at the moment.
You mentioned ESG factors, that's environmental, social, and governance. Let's take a deeper dive on how firms can boost integration of those into their business models. And Philipp, in Green Ferry, in the book, you mentioned that the vast majority of studies that you examined show that strong ESG standards actually reduce capital costs. That's essentially what Matthias has also just told us. And in fact, boost stock performance. Yet, as I mentioned a moment ago, firms face a complex and fragmented array of rules, standards, reporting requirements. So to what degree do SMEs, for example, have sufficient information and understanding of what's required? Is there a framework or an approach that's widely understood and applied?
Yes, and I hope that's not too self-serving to say that everything that Katharina and I know has gone into our book Green Ferry. So I do think that is hopefully a helpful framework to guide executives, because even as a so-called expert in the area, this is incredibly complex. It's fast-paced, and to keep abreast of just the regulation in the European space, from the Green Claims Directive to the reporting requirements to the Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive, and so on and so forth. And I just mentioned really a small subset of rules and regulation coming our way. And of course, that's just the EU. There's a separate set of guidance in the US and other countries. So it is incredibly complex. Yet I think we really break it down and distinguish between your core business, your value chain, your organizational maturity really helps to kind of chart the transformational course ahead. And transforming your core business is never a quick win, but along the value chain, I think there are a couple of quick wins, be that driving energy efficiency that typically immediately pays. And everybody says, of course, we've done our homework. And then you bring in people that have done this work before, that share expertise, and you have quick payback periods on energy efficiency in almost all companies that take this serious. Installing solar, producing your own electricity. Of course, many companies have done this already, but I know from so many companies that systematically screen opportunities to do so, and then they're surprised how much they still find and how quick payback periods have become.
Interesting, thank you. And as Philipp just pointed out, Katharina, long gone is the time when all of this was purely voluntary and firms getting together at conferences and saying, okay, let's do this and this. Measures like the EU's taxonomy are aimed at pushing business to move faster and more transparently. But what would you say is needed beyond that? What further concrete policies need to be implemented to help companies transition faster?
Mm-hmm. So my key project is to integrate at least CO2, because it can be transformed already quite easily into a euro or dollar or whatever monetary term, CO2 into balance sheets. Yeah, right now they only display financial transactions, and also social aspects like personnel is in there mainly because they cost. And also the environment is there maybe because you have to expect fines. But you could integrate environmental and maybe somewhen also social aspects into this core method of steering a large company at least. And that is what Germany agreed to develop. At least a blueprint starting with CO2, with the climate issue that can be steered and managed. And I also would suggest, you referenced small and medium enterprise companies already, that it is very, very good that large companies have already started to have a broad array of sustainability topics in their reporting, and it is coming also in the Sustainability Reporting Directive and standards. Yet at least the CO2 part, I think that is something that will be crucial for everyone to know. And that is something where I want to add to Philipp's motivation part, that it can not only be good, but also in a way motivating for companies and also for their staff. We have a big staff issue as well in Germany, at least in Germany, to attract talent. And motivation and purpose around being part of something that I've understood how the world is working at the moment is also good. And there I think we need to be a bit merciful and also wise, and not asking everything from everybody in the start, but where it's possible to start with methods that are there, CO2, and where you can go beyond. Biodiversity is one of the next big things that companies who have already a track record there can also develop that further. A second thing I would like to add, and there are many other regulations, I don't want to spoil it here, everything regarding time, but I think because we are also in a global call, it is very important that those countries who emitted so much of the CO2 that is already out there take more responsibility in the climate negotiations and in the payments to countries of the global south, as you say it. I don't want to mix them all together, but those companies who will suffer most to the consequences, and I think we need to take more responsibility on that, and also there at least took some good directions with the new government. I hope not enough, I would say, but I think that is a big thing with regards to looking at this globally.
You're talking there about the so-called loss and damage discussion, which has been part of the UN climate conferences. Later on, I want to take a deep dive on the role of, yeah.
I would suggest not only, it's also about if we make, for example, new trade agreements with Brazil, Mercosur, to also financially support alternatives to reducing the Amazonias. So I would say maybe people need some money, in order to find alternative jobs, and there I think we need to take more. So it's different. That's one aspect, but there are also other aspects we need to consider there.
And I do want to come back to that a little bit later when we talk more about the role of government. But if I can go over to you, Matthias, from a business perspective, how do you at Bayer navigate between setting voluntary commitments and complying with regulations in this area? Does Bayer's own sustainability strategy, for example, which you spearheaded, go beyond what current law and regulatory frameworks would require?
In many areas, yes. In some areas, we have been piloting things that are now part of the EU-wide or German regulation. And Katharina just talked about carbon pricing. I think that's a great example. We have identified an internal carbon price, first starting with our own operations, and have extended that also to our suppliers. And the benefit of it is you don't need to do additional training or additional convincing. The very same Excel sheets that are currently driving decisions, for example, when you purchase a service or a product from a supplier, will work, but carbon and a carbon price will be much more integrated. The whole topic of carbon pricing is politically quite challenging because it can upset wider populations, voters, and can also reduce buy-in into the transition. But that shouldn't stop companies from using mechanisms that actually put a price on something to drive transformation. For carbon, it's fairly easy, and that's something we have started. We didn't go very extreme from a carbon price perspective. We went with 100 euros per ton. If you look at the markets at the moment, that is kind of something where also many carbon markets are already, to some point, they exceeded that. But even with a more moderate carbon price, you see changes in the prioritization of capital allocation budgets or suppliers you choose. And our commitment is not only to reduce our own emissions, but also to reduce the footprint of our immediate supply chain. And for that, these kind of voluntary measures really help. I do believe that in some areas, it's really important to have very clear standards. For example, I welcome that ESG rating agencies are much more regulated in the future because that will create a level playing field and a more objective view on the impact the companies they are rating are having. Currently, unlike in the financial space, in the ESG rating space, you have a very broad set of assessments, even though we are talking about the same planet. And to kind of reduce the noise and kind of focus everybody on the same impact parameters is a good thing.
Can you just tell us, when you were moving to adopt this internal company-wide carbon pricing, were there some skeptics in the company? And do you now find that most of senior management are aligned with this?
Yeah, obviously senior management is aligned with it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have decided to go down that route. And I have to say, I think it's good that there are skeptics because the journey we are embarking and also the journey you describe, Katharina and Philipp, in Green Ferry is not a journey that is easy or where we already know everything. So skepticism or dissent is actually a good thing. And yes, you get a lot of that when you embark on a journey like that. However, what also helps is to align the incentive systems. A wise man once said that you can't make a man, in this case, to do one thing if he is rewarded for do the opposite. It was Upton Sinclair in The Jungle. And we talk often a lot about the things that don't work well, but look at the German DAX companies at the moment. When we embarked on that journey, I think Bayer was the third company in DAX that had ESG metrics in their long-term incentive. Now all 40 have it. So you see the incentive systems aligning with what's being communicated at the sustainability event. And for me, that's a crucial thing. If you don't do that, of course, dissenters will say, well, but I'm rewarded for the opposite. So why would I embark on that journey?
And a quick follow-up also to you, Matthias, if I may, in regard to the value of this also for getting talent. I think it was Katharina who mentioned that as an important way to try to motivate employees who are looking for purpose in companies. Many companies, nonetheless, only offer pretty limited training when it comes to sustainability. What is Bayer doing in that area? How does Bayer make this part of essentially its human resources outreach?
I personally don't like the term human resources. So these are actually human beings, and they want to be. And what we see in the data is consistent, and it's actually also consistent from a global perspective. So this is not just a few countries' perspective. Unilever was actually the first company that really tapped into the insight that you can attract talent if you get serious on sustainability. And the reason being that yes, you work for a company, but you also live a life that goes well beyond that. And there's a huge concern across large populations about what's going on. We experience that in almost every conversation we have. The critical point is when you attract talent, that they then in their jobs realize you really mean it. So what I'm looking for is not just the trainings, but it's like the day-to-day experience. Are people really able to make a difference? Do they have the autonomy to do it? Or are we producing cynicism by not really delivering what's in the more beautiful communication pamphlets that we put out there? So the day-to-day experience and reality is what I'm looking at. We're also measuring the extent to which buyer employees believe in our sustainability strategy. And you can see there in pockets of the organizations, people don't see it. So what we are doing then is obsessing about those pockets and trying to make sure that we understand why we don't get the feedback we would like to see, which is one that says we put our money where our mouth is in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Katharina, you wanted to react to that?
Yeah, I would like to add something about my consulting, from my consulting practice before. I was very much engaged in the HR and purpose aspects around sustainability, and also did both a study and some projects. And I would just like to underline very strongly what Matthias just said. This, if you get serious, we heard about big frustration levels in companies where CEOs had big speeches at Davos and said how sustainable they are, attracted talent sometimes to headquarters in not so attractive cities. People moved there and then they are there, and the company is not living up to the promises, and that creates frustration and also even increases that people leave the company again. And what we suggest also in our book around communication is a bit more boldness and honesty at the same time. So being bold to be honest. We have one example from another DAX company who started with a pioneering exercise on product portfolio management, and it was BASF, and they had a risky product segment, and they were really afraid of communicating that also to shareholders. But shareholders appreciated that because they knew, they have identified the problem and they are dealing with it because they wanted to reduce of the share of the risky product segment. And therefore a problem was seen and it was dealt with, and it was taken serious, or let's say in an educated manner. And that is what employees in the experience of all the studies we did there and these projects also saw. They don't care if you're 100% perfect, but they need to believe you that you're trying to do the right thing. And to underline as well, it is an exciting journey. It's complex, as Philipp said, and therefore you can't be perfect. And that's something that we should embrace positively, that it's also about innovation and experimenting, to put it in the positive side. And therefore we shouldn't expect of each of us 100% perfectness in this area, but at least the 100% will.
Mm-hmm. Transparency and trust, in other words, go hand in hand. I just want to take in one or two questions from audience members. And by the way, we do have an audience that reaches from Pakistan, Italy, Brazil, India, Turkey, Germany, to the US, Indonesia, Kenya, Israel, and Ethiopia. So lots of people with us across the globe. A question has come in from Shankar Mandapaka, and he or she, I guess it's probably a he, asks about the debate on measuring green credits at organization level. And Philipp, I see you nodding to that, so maybe you want to respond. And I have another one as well from Shankar, which is whether carbon pricing, if it is taken into account in a company, impacts logistic costs of shipments. So can I put both of those to Philipp? And then I see Matthias nodding his head as well. So I'll come to him after that. Go ahead.
Maybe let me take the second first, whether an internal carbon price factually increases cost. And that really depends on the approach taken. And the approach could either be that the internal carbon price is purely calculated for information purposes, and then it doesn't increase cost. It just provides better information, and that information can then either be binding in the decision making, like Matthias mentioned. It's just included in the Excel sheet and it contributes to decision making in the same way that another cost item would. Or it could just be an information item that may or may not be considered. There are other approaches where the internal carbon price is actually used as a fee. And so whatever business unit incurs or drives that carbon has to pay a fee in a central fund, out of which, for example, energy efficiency or other investment into the green transition are done. And that, of course, drives cost for that particular unit, but the cost stays within the business and facilitates an investment into the green transformation. These are just two out of the many approaches that are possible.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I'll go over to Matthias if you also want to pick up either of those two questions: green credits within organizations and or cost rises.
I think in our world, both ways of dealing with carbon pricing are happening. So if it's purely internal and purely our capital allocation budget, then certain projects rise to the top because carbon pricing, the benefit of reducing carbon emissions, is better reflected. The moment you move into a negotiation with somebody outside of your company, so with a supplier, then the carbon price is an actual cost, because you may choose a product or a service that is more expensive than the one you would otherwise choose, because you just put a carbon price on the whole deal. And of course, that money you actually have to pay. The way I look at this, though, is that ultimately carbon will become more and more expensive. So the more you take carbon out of your value chain, and the more you are like in a vanguard position, the less you will pay later. So for me, it's kind of an insurance. And we've seen it with renewable energy. So we invest a lot in renewable energy capacity. I'll give you one example. The largest ever single company project we just announced a couple of weeks ago, which is 1.4 terawatt hours. It's roughly 15% of all the renewable energy capacity that Germany has created since 2022. So it's really a large project for one company. If you are fast in this kind of projects, you reap a lot of benefits. And the good news for renewables is, and we compared it to both fossil and nuclear alternatives, it's a big project in the United States. The good news for renewables is it's fairly competitive. So fast in this case means you actually reap an additional benefit, and that is that electricity in the next 10 years will be cheaper for you than for your competition.
Mm-hmm. I also have a question specifically to you, Matthias, from Thorsten Becker. He says, are there audited figures from Bayer for scope 1, 2, and 3? What about the short, medium, and long-term consequences and impacts of Bayer's products, for example, in agriculture, on biodiversity, drought, soil degradation, climate gases?
So first of all, yes, there are. And I think it's really important for sustainability reporting that it's audited with the same rigor financial figures are audited. From that vantage point, the work that's currently going on European level to standardize that is very welcomed and very helpful. And we have very clear data on our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. For those who are not completely familiar, scope 1 and 2 is actually the carbon emissions that are directly linked to your operations. Scope 3 is for sure your supply chain, and sometimes companies report on their full value chain. So what's happening before and after they produce a product or a service. We have clear targets. We want to cut our emissions in half in the first decade. We want to do that again in the next decade, and then one more time in the decade from 2040 to 49. The reason why we have to do that is that's the only way to stay in line with the Paris climate goals. And the audit helps us to credibly state where we are making progress and where we are not making progress. When you look into our sustainability report, you also find the first attempts to measure carbon intensity, for example, of different crop systems. So corn being grown in the United States versus Spain versus Brazil, you kind of can see the differences in crop country combinations for the major crops, which is a precondition for us to extend our commitment along our whole value chain. So to not only measure our direct emissions, but also measure the capacity and capability of our innovation pipeline to take on even larger amounts of carbon. So currently, our own scope 1, 2, 3 emissions are roughly 15 million tons. If we really transformed agriculture, we are probably an order of magnitude, potentially even more out there in our capacity to reduce carbon emissions. So that's where innovation really tackles the big prize, which is the 54 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. If you, Thorsten, want to learn more about that, our sustainability report is a good source where you can see that documented and as well audited and validated by our auditors.
Thank you very much. And then if I can go over to Katharina with one more question from Tanya Boba, and she is asking on sustainability and purpose, how do we demonstrate purpose when we take actions? Could we subdivide the priorities into multiple years and create a framework to create subsets of purpose in a vision for, let's say, the next 3, the next 5 years, and so on? What do you think about that?
Very strategic question, and I like that very much. It's really important to operationalize somehow, what it means. And there we come to, if you're in a large company, it's very important to somehow define one level below what your purpose is. Probably it's somewhat about somehow being aligned in the planetary boundaries with regards to climate, but it might also be related to your product portfolio, like Matthias just said, with regards to hunger or something related to that. You would need some metrics then, and to feel it in the decision-making of the company. It needs to be integrated in decision-making criteria. When you look into an R&D process, there are criteria like convenience, etc., quality, but also the purpose related. So maybe a climate criterion, maybe one regarding hunger, to stay with that example, would need to be there. Does it apply to this product category, innovation category, so that people feel that the company is serious, that it's being integrated into decision-making on every level? And as Matthias said, also in the incentive schemes of the senior and also maybe middle management. So it needs to be somehow very integrated logically, with not too many disruptancies that make it contradictory. And with regards to the time span looking forward, of course, you should then define some targets where you want to be by when. And it might be absolute targets, but also performance targets, maybe also a target of your employees feeling the purpose in every day, and then understanding where you can become better. And I substantiate with what Tanya is asking, that you can and you have to operationalize. Otherwise, you fall into that trap of not being convincing and not really managing the thing.
And let me bring in a question from Jonas Viering, and perhaps to Philipp, but if Matthias or Katharina want to comment as well, you're welcome. The question from Jonas Viering is, how would you address the issue of timing? While unmitigated climate change clearly threatens all businesses, short-term investment into greening businesses yield rather long-term effects for the climate. And there's also a free riding issue. Businesses that don't invest into greening still profit from climate stabilization. Philipp?
Yeah, I think first of all, energy, as Matthias pointed out earlier, renewable energy is price competitive, and the majority of emissions are driven by energy consumption. And so I think the really good news is that as we build new capacity, that often is profitable to build renewable capacity. Now, clearly, there are more issues, and I think we should not focus on climate alone. There are other important planetary boundaries: biodiversity, land use, freshwater, ocean health. And if we truthfully want to operate within planetary boundaries, we need to consider all of them. And it's not arbitrary how to consider them, because science tells us the journey ahead of us. Net zero before 2050, reverse and halt nature loss by 2030 or latest 2040. And there are transition pathways to move from where we are today to that future. Now, can all of this be done profitably, as is the case for some of the renewable capacity? Clearly not. And that, of course, is a huge challenge for business, figuring out where can I meaningfully make an investment? What is the return I can expect? Where can I simply not do that investment now, but need to wait for government framework and regulation to force the whole competitive set to make adjustments? And yeah, clearly, it invites for free riding for those companies that purely maximize short-term profits. But I think these companies, as the term implies, are very short-term focused. And I think sooner or later, reality will catch up with them, and it might be locked in a non-competitive, exploitative business model that is no longer winning in the next decade.
So you're really reinforcing the point that Matthias made earlier, that an early mover will be rewarded essentially because the company has a business model then that is highly competitive, that gives it real strategic advantages. Let me take a deeper dive now with all of you on the role of government, because this is something that we are hearing more and more about in the face of the multiple reinforcing crises that the world. Yes, please.
And I'm really sorry. Before we move there, I really wanted to
please
add one aspect to the first mover problem, to sum it up like that. That is one of these large things that Philipp, after our, let's say, together more than 30 years of experience in sustainability and how to convince companies and business units and calculating business cases, etc. Sometimes also in other domains like investing in China or investing in a digitalization project or so, you also, company leaders do things because they want to do them. Yeah, and it's also an effect of doing what is right. And I know that might seem sometimes a bit far away from experienced realities, but I've seen these decisions in different areas than sustainability. And sustainability somehow often had to even have a more sound business case. And even though it had a very sound business case, the digital project was done because it was cool, because people and companies and business units wanted it. And therefore, I just want to add this aspect of that you can make these choices depending on where you are in a smaller or larger decision frame and impact frame, also because you are convinced. And that is something that might seem a bit far away from all the business case calculations that we know, but we also know they are often very much based on assumptions. And therefore, I just wanted to open the opportunity space a bit of being able to take good decisions.
Thank you very much for adding that, Katharina. Let's talk just a bit more about the role of government in the context of the rise of industrial policy that we're currently seeing. And that is clearly a response not simply to the climate crisis, but also to the socioeconomic effects of the pandemic, the Russian war on Ukraine, and more. And many policymakers see industrial policy now as essential also to level the global playing field vis-a-vis China, for example, but also as a way of influencing the direction of the economy and firms' behavior. Philipp, do you think that governments can and should prohibit certain technologies and set clear priorities that favor others? We are, of course, hearing a lot of debate now here in Germany over the government decision to require a phase out of gas-powered heaters and introduce very clear incentives for technology like heat pumps. What's your take? Is that form of intervention in the market necessary, or is it excessive?
Always a tricky question, but to my mind, like a high CO2 price, like a clear statement that internal combustion engines will be phased out, I think these are very important policy signals that just guide decision-making and investments. And we talk about huge investments in a renewable energy capacity, into electrification of mobility, electrification of life and living and heating our homes, cooling and heating our homes. And so I think to the extent that governments can give that clear guidance, long-term thinking, without being overly prescriptive, that is absolutely welcome and helpful.
Katharina, how much technology neutrality can we afford at a time when the climate crisis is so urgent?
I think the discussion about technology neutrality is totally overrated, because if you can be, I would love to be very open to innovation and everything. On the other hand, if you remember FCKW, there are some harmful things that also need to be prohibited. And therefore, I think sometimes
those were the refrigerators. Maybe we'll just remind our audience who don't, those were the fluorocarbons in refrigerators, and in fact, an international coalition to get rid of them and to close the ozone hole proved to be very effective indeed, and led to some great new refrigerators.
And I think it's always a debate of a good mix of policy measures. Right. I don't want to prohibit any things. It feels really bad to prohibit things. But also, if I just raise the price, we have a social problem. So sometimes, let's say, saying this technology is the new default, renewable energy heat pump or heating system. You have 9 technologies, by the way, in the original law as well already. That is making things easier for people. And that is what I said in the beginning. I want to make it easy to convert to sustainability. And I'm a very, very technology fan. And on the other hand, we need to find solutions that go over price, and maybe also, let's say, the phasing out of a combustion engine, as Philipp said, when it's just necessary. So you have an opportunity to plan things as well accordingly in companies. And we had as well a conservative environmental minister who said he did a lot about laws that said this is right and that is wrong. So that's a bit, I think, also quite a German discussion in a way. Yeah, I think other countries banned plastic bags, etc., because they are just bad. Yeah, and we sometimes ban things. And I want to make incentives for cool innovations, for the great technologies, and in the end, being impact oriented towards an economy that is future fit, meaning operating within the planetary boundaries for the greater good of all, and as well profitable for the companies. And if we need to prohibit things, okay, but I would love to do it with incentives and different market rules, a little bit shifting these small things like the balance sheets. I prefer that personally, but sometimes I think it's inevitable to also say that is just a thing of yesterday, or it's harmful and we shouldn't do it anymore.
Matthias,
if I may add, I'm a huge fan of industrial policy. It's sometimes, especially when you talk in business cycles, people don't like the term. They like market forces to operate. When I look globally at what's going on, we need a really fast transition. And from that vantage point, clarity beats like 1,000 flowers blooming when it comes to transformation. China will meet their goal to have a majority of energy being produced with renewable sources already this year, 2 years ahead of what they had announced. And this is even a bigger success because the hydropower sources have been strained by climate change. So in other words, the hydropower that was part of the plan has not been delivering as predicted. And why did that happen? A, the technology is competitive. We stated that a couple of times. B, the government was very clear all the way down to county level that they want decarbonization of the energy production. And C, of course, the government supported that. And now you could say, yeah, it's China, and it's like Communist Party, and so on. So let's go to where I'm at the moment, United States. You have a very clear revival of industrial policy with a strong focus on green, but let's not kid ourselves. It's not only about green, it's also very much traditionally about jobs. And again, if something like that happens in the United States, if carrots beat sticks at the moment in the way those two countries look at things, this should send a signal to Europe to also focus on much more openness towards supporting industry. Carbon contracts for difference is one example how you can make that happen. So you really help industries in the transformation process. And I've spoken to a lot of economists who don't like it because it's too much state for them. But I think given what's at stake, the state needs to be very active in this space in order to ensure that an industrial core can be maintained in a time of transition. Now, the problem we have is also our opportunity. The problem we have in Europe is fossil fuels aren't as cheap anymore. So if you will, Putin's aggression created some sort of carbon tax that now changes everything. That's a problem, but also an opportunity for us to accelerate the transformation in Europe.
Thank you very much. And
may I add what I think Biden said, when I hear climate or when I hear green, but I think when I hear climate, I hear jobs. Just to link together the old and the new.
I was going to ask you, Matthias, because Bayer, of course, does business both in the European market and in, well, worldwide. But when you look at the way the US is handling the Inflation Reduction Act and also green incentives, I'm often told by business people working in both markets that the US approach is much more open and efficient because it simply sets a carbon target and lets the company decide how to get there. Whereas the European Union allegedly tries to regulate too much, too granular. Would you agree with that?
I think, generally speaking, yes. I also think that we shouldn't underestimate the pragmatism in the United States. So when we built our renewable energy project in Idaho, which is more a conservative state, we got a lot of support simply because it meant jobs, it meant tax revenues, and there is a lot of pragmatism when it comes to these kind of factors in the US. That is something that is often underestimated, also when the debate is a bit like politicized. So the US currently has better conditions for investments in the green transition and cheaper hydrocarbons. So if you will, both the transformation as well as the status quo is better supported in the US than in Europe. And if you want to keep jobs in Europe, you need to acknowledge that and then work on that. I believe that we need sort of a green agenda 2010 in Europe, not only in Germany, but in Europe. During the last reign of the Greens in Germany, there were very tough decisions being made in the agenda 2010 to keep an industrial core. Something like that is necessary again. And Katharina said something about transition in the countries that are not part of the European, the American, or the Chinese bloc. And frankly speaking, the transfer of innovation in those countries and the empowerment so that they can leapfrog is something we need to pay much more attention to.
Let us take one more audience question. Our time is limited, but I just want to bring in a question from Russell Williams, who says, agriculture does indeed have enormous potential to positively impact the planet, but there is hesitancy among farmers because programs or incentive levels are either impractical or insufficient to cover the costs of transitioning to new practices. How can companies and/or governments help socialize the costs that farmers will incur when adopting regenerative or sustainable practices? Philipp, do you want to take a quick stab at that?
Very happy to, and maybe this even brings us back to the beginning where we spoke about Homo economicus and believing that you optimize yourself by purely focusing on your own short-term gains. And I believe actually company along the food value chain have a benefit by, in partnership, investing in changing practices and building capacity, especially those that procure raw material from smallholder farmers, they currently run the risk that their supply of these raw materials is drying up as these farms are hit by the effects of climate change. And so those agricultural raw material sources that proactively and in partnership invest in the capacity of smallholder farmers and others to adjust to changing weather patterns, I think are those that build the trust and the goodwill to continue and build resilient long-term supply relationships. So I absolutely think that, if we bring this back to moving from a self-centered, purely transactional homo economicus to transforming in partnership, we absolutely can help these farmers and help agriculture raw material sources.
Thank you very much. And a very quick last question to all three of you, if I may, and it's based on something put out there by an author that I know, Matthias, you respect quite a bit, Andrew McAfee. In his book, More from Less, he makes the case that economy and ecology are not simply reconcilable, but that in fact, capitalism and technological progress are key drivers that allow us to do more with fewer resources. But he says that's not going to happen automatically, and it requires two further drivers: public awareness and responsive government to address market imbalances. So to all three of you, super quickly, what in your view are the most crucial 2 or 3 areas where we need more awareness and or more governance? Katharina, I'll start with you.
Integrate at least CO2 into financial decision-making through integrating into financial reporting standards. And secondly, the awareness that change might be hard, but it's really, really worth it. And that a better life for all is ahead of us, and that we can overcome being afraid.
And certainly, I think that's what you were trying to do by showing us those islands in the book Green Ferry. Philipp, your answer?
So more with less to me sounds a lot like efficiency. And I would actually argue we transform not by focusing on efficiency. In other words, by being less bad is not good enough. And in fact, I think we fundamentally need to rethink what we do and really come up with new solutions that are not just more efficient, but are qualitatively different, are regenerative by design.
Matthias, last word to you.
And I can build on that. Next week on Tuesday, actually, Rodrigo Santos, who leads our crop science business, will have a rollout of a huge strategic shift in our agricultural business towards regenerative agriculture. We will get more participation when farmers not only are planting cover crops because they are asked to do that by regulators, but when they can make money in doing so. So I think that's the important part here. We need to make sure that the way we design our policies attracts people's creativity and doesn't just coerce them to move in one or the other direction. We've seen that with renewable energy. I think the same is possible in agriculture. Agriculture can be reducing carbon emissions, but also can turn into be better adapted. And then last but not least, I would say that policy needs to welcome innovation, and we'll have that debate this summer when the European Union introduces new measures on how to deal with new breeding technologies, for example. That's going to be a very important debate about whether the necessary innovation is at the fingertips of the people that are creative and responsible enough to use them.
Thank you very, very much. I think that's a great note to end on. So many thanks to all three of you for taking the time to talk about this very important topic today. Clearly, economy and ecology are reconcilable, and all of you are working toward that aim. Look, we're seeing the book right now. Dear viewers, unfortunately, this book at the moment is still in German, although it does have a title easily understood by us English speakers. But the book hopefully will eventually be translated into English, and then all of you I'm sure, can find out how inspirational it absolutely is. So many thanks, not only to our speakers, but also to everyone who dialed in from all over the world. We're grateful for your attention and also for the contributions that you've made with your questions and comments. And we hope to see you again soon. Until then, I wish everybody a good day and stay healthy and safe.
Thank you so much, Melinda.